You never think the moment your marriage ends will be over something as simple as a suitcase. It wasn't a fight about another woman or a massive financial scandal, though those would have been more dramatic, I guess. No, it was because my old battered suitcase, the one that had been with me since I was 18, was sitting in the middle of the pristine white marble foyer of our penthouse. I'd just gotten back from a 3-day trip to see my sick sister. The cab ride from the airport was long, and all I wanted was a hot shower and to curl up in my own bed. I was kicking off my heels by the door, my back aching, when his voice cut through the quiet luxury of the space. "Evelyn, what is that?" I looked up. Liam stood at the entrance to the living room, dressed in a custom-tailored suit even though it was past 8 p.m. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't frowning. He was assessing. His eyes, that cool, calculating gray I used to find so captivating, were fixed not on me, but on the floor, on my suitcase. I followed his gaze. The suitcase was a faded floral print. One of the wheels was permanently cocked to the side, and there was a small, duct-tape tear on the side from a particularly rough baggage handler in Rome. It was shabby. I knew it was shabby, but it was also me. "It's my suitcase, Liam," I said, a tired sigh in my voice. "I just got home." "It's filthy," he stated, his voice flat. "It's scratching the marble. And it smells like airport." A laugh, brittle and sharp, almost escaped me. "It's a suitcase. That's what they do. They go to airports." He didn't even crack a smile. He never did anymore. He took a step closer, his hands in his pockets, a gesture of casual dismissal that made my stomach clench. "Just take it to the garbage chute. I'll have my assistant order you a new set of Tumi luggage tomorrow. The carbon fiber ones." There it was. The solution to everything. Throw it away. Buy a new, expensive, shiny replacement. The thought hit me like a physical blow. Is that what he thinks of me? Of us? "No," I said, the word quiet but firm. "I'm not throwing it away." His jaw tightened. That was the only sign that I'd surprised him. Disobedience was not part of the script. "Evelyn, don't be sentimental. It's trash." "It's not trash to me," I shot back, my voice rising. "This suitcase has been with me for 15 years, Liam. It was with me in my first crappy apartment. It came with me on our backpacking trip through Thailand, for God's sake. You used to think its stubborn will was charming." "That was a long time ago," he said, and his voice was so cold, it felt like the temperature in the room had dropped. "We don't live in that world anymore. I've worked too hard to build this life, this image, to have it compromised by a piece of garbage in my foyer." My foyer, not ours. His. We stood there, staring at each other across a 10-foot expanse of polished, cold stone. The man I loved, the man I'd built a life with, was looking at a piece of my history, a piece of our history, and all he saw was an eyesore. He finally broke the silence, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I can't sleep with the smell of jet fuel and sentimentality in my space. You've been traveling. Sleep in the guest room tonight." And he turned, walking back into the living room as if he'd just commented on the weather. "Sleep in the guest room." The words echoed in the vast, silent foyer. They weren't just words. They were a dismissal. A relegation. I was no longer his wife in that moment. I was a messy inconvenience he was banishing to a sterile, unused room down the hall so he wouldn't be disturbed. I looked down at the suitcase. The duct tape. The crooked wheel. And in that moment, it wasn't just a suitcase. It was a symbol of everything I had let myself become. A polished, quiet, acceptable accessory to Liam Sterling, billionaire. I had packed away my own life, my own memories, my own smell, into this case, and he wanted to throw it in the incinerator. A memory, sharp and painful, flashed behind my eyes. It was from 7 years ago. We were in our tiny one-bedroom apartment, eating cheap takeout on the floor because we couldn't afford a table. My suitcase was sitting open in the corner, half unpacked from a work trip. Liam had just gotten his first big break, a massive investment for his tech startup. He was buzzing with excitement, his eyes alight with a fire I hadn't seen in years. "When I'm rich, Evie," he'd said, grabbing my hands, "the first thing I'm going to do is buy you a whole set of the most expensive, beautiful luggage in the world. You'll never have to lug this old thing around again." I'd laughed and squeezed his hands. "I don't want new luggage. I want this one. It's got stories. Our stories." He'd kissed me then, a deep, passionate kiss full of hope and a shared future. "Okay," he'd whispered against my lips. "Then we'll keep it forever." For luck. Forever had apparently expired the moment his net worth crossed the 10-digit mark. Standing there in the foyer, the ghost of that kiss on my lips and the cold reality of his dismissal seeping into my bones, something inside me broke. Or maybe something that had been dormant for years finally woke up. Sleep in the guest room? No. I wasn't going to sleep in the guest room. I wasn't going to sleep in this house. A terrifying, exhilarating calm settled over me. I picked up my shabby, loyal, beautiful suitcase. I didn't drag it. I carried it, hugging its worn fabric to my chest. I didn't go to the guest room. I walked straight into my home office, the one I never used anymore because Liam's interior designer had made it so serene, it felt like a museum. I set the suitcase down gently. Then I walked to my desk, unlocked the bottom drawer with a key I kept taped underneath it, and pulled out a simple manila folder. On the tab, a single word was typed: dissolution. I'd had these papers for 6 months. My lawyer, a fierce woman named Brenda who had been my college roommate, had drawn them up after the last time Liam had missed our anniversary. "Just to have, Evie," she'd said, her eyes full of pity and concern. "Just so you know you have a choice." I'd stuffed them in the drawer, horrified at myself for even considering it. But I'd never thrown them away. Now I understood why. This wasn't about a suitcase. This was about respect. This was about my soul. And he had just made it abundantly clear that in his world, my soul had no more value than a piece of duct-taped luggage. I clutched the folder to my chest, the weight of it both terrifying and solid. This was it. The turning point. The moment I stopped being the woman who slept in the guest room and started being the woman who walked out the front door. My heart wasn't breaking. It was hardening into something new. Something stronger. I took a deep breath, my plan forming with terrifying clarity. I wouldn't scream. I wouldn't cry. Not in front of him. I would do this with the same cold, detached precision he had just used on me. I was going to give him his divorce papers. And I was going to do it right now. I walked out of the office, the manila folder feeling like a lead weight in my hand. My heart wasn't pounding with panic anymore. It was beating a slow, determined rhythm. A war drum. I could hear the soft clink of glass from the living room. He was pouring himself a drink, probably a 25-year-old Macallan. The ritual of his success. The day was over. The inconvenient wife had been dealt with, and now he could relax. I stopped at the threshold of the living room. It was a space designed for magazine spreads, all sharp angles, minimalist furniture, and art that was more investment than inspiration. He was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to me, looking out at the glittering city lights that were his domain. The crystal tumbler was in his hand. "Liam." He didn't turn around. "I thought you were going to the guest room, Evelyn." His voice was tired, annoyed. I was disrupting his peace. "I'm not." That got him to turn. His eyes flicked from my face, down to the folder in my hands, and back to my face. A slight, almost imperceptible frown creased his brow. He wasn't concerned, not yet. He was just confused. Anomalies in his perfectly ordered world were rare. "What's that? More charitable foundation paperwork? Can't it wait until morning?" He took a sip of his whiskey. "My assistant can schedule a time for you later this week." Every word was another nail. His assistant. Schedule a time. I was his wife, and I needed an appointment. I walked further into the room, my bare feet silent on the priceless silk rug. I stopped a few feet from him, close enough to see the faint lines of stress around his eyes that no amount of money could erase. I held out the folder. "It's not for the foundation," I said, my voice eerily calm. "It's for you." He sighed a long-suffering sound, and finally took the folder. He opened it, his movements efficient and bored. I watched his face. I saw the exact moment his eyes scanned the first page. The boredom vanished, replaced by a flicker of disbelief. Then, his head snapped up, his gaze sharp and piercing. "What is this?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "You can read," I said, crossing my arms over my chest. "It's a petition for the dissolution of our marriage." The word divorce hung in the air between us, ugly and final. He stared at me as if I'd started speaking in tongues. A strange, choked sound escaped his lips. It was almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it. It was pure, unadulterated shock. "Are you out of your mind?" he finally managed, his voice rising. "Is this a joke?" "Because of a suitcase." "This has nothing to do with the suitcase, Liam," I said, and I was surprised at how steady I was. "The suitcase was just the final, pathetic symptom. This is about the disease." He threw the folder onto the low glass coffee table. It skidded and knocked over a small, abstract sculpture. It didn't break. Of course it didn't. Everything in this house was built to withstand impact. Except, apparently, me. "The disease," he repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What disease, Evelyn?" "The disease of a successful life. The disease of giving you everything you could possibly want." "You gave me everything you wanted." The calm finally cracked, and my voice rose, fueled by years of suppressed resentment. "You wanted a beautiful wife to stand beside you at galas, so I learned which fork to use. You wanted a quiet, elegant home, so I packed away all my colorful, mismatched things. You wanted a life that looked perfect in a portfolio, and I let you turn me into one of your assets. A well-maintained, silent, and appreciating one." He took a step toward me, his face a mask of cold fury. Don't you dare pretend you haven't enjoyed this. The clothes, the cars, the vacations, the respect that comes with my name. Is that what you call it? Respect." I shot back, a bitter laugh tearing from my throat. "The way your business partners' wives look at me with pity? The way your assistant talks to me like I'm a slightly slow child? The way you just told me to sleep in the guest room like I was a dog that had rolled in something foul? That's your version of respect? I'd hate to see your version of contempt." "This is insane," he spat, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "You're throwing away 10 years of marriage over a bad mood." And there it was. The final, complete dismissal of my feelings. It wasn't a fundamental breakdown of our relationship. It was just me being emotional. Hysterical. It was the oldest trick in the book, and he was using it on me. A memory, sharp and clear, cut through the anger. It was from about 4 years ago. We were at a charity auction. I had spent weeks working on it, curating the items, liaising with the donors. It was the first thing that had felt like my project in years. That night, during his speech, he'd stood up at the podium, in front of 500 of the city's elite, and he'd said, "I'm so proud of my beautiful wife, Evelyn, for putting together this lovely little event. It's so wonderful that she has a hobby to keep her busy." Hobby. The word had felt like a slap. I had raised over $2 million that night, and he'd reduced it to a hobby. I had confronted him about it later, in the limo on the way home. He'd been genuinely baffled. "What's the problem?" he'd asked. "I called you beautiful and said I was proud of you. What more do you want?" I had cried that night, feeling foolish and ungrateful. Now I just felt numb. He would never understand. He was incapable of it. "I'm not throwing away 10 years, Liam," I said, my voice dropping back to that calm, deadly quiet. "I'm salvaging whatever I have left of the next 40. I won't spend them as a guest in my own life." His eyes narrowed. I could see the gears turning in his head, shifting from anger to strategy. This was a problem to be solved. A negotiation to be won. "Fine," he said, his tone changing, becoming businesslike. "If this is what you want, we'll do it. But we'll do it quietly, and my lawyers will handle it. You can keep the penthouse. I'll set up a generous allowance. A very generous one. But you will not drag my name through the mud. Do you understand?" He thought he could buy his way out of this, too. He thought he could add amicable divorce to his list of acquisitions. I looked at this man, this stranger I had loved, and I felt a profound, bottomless sadness. But I didn't feel doubt. "I don't want your money, Liam," I said, and I meant it. I don't want this penthouse. I don't want any of it. I have my own lawyer. Her name is Brenda. You remember her. You'll be hearing from her. I turned and walked out of the living room. I didn't look back. I went straight to his bedroom. I ignored the vast, cold space and went to the walk-in closet that was the size of our first apartment. I walked past the racks of designer clothes, the shelves of handbags, all chosen by a stylist to fit the image. I went to the very back, to a small old trunk. I opened it. Inside were my old jeans, a faded band t-shirt, a worn-out leather jacket, the clothes I'd worn before I became Evelyn Sterling. I pulled them on. They smelled of cedar and dust in me, the real me. Then I went back to my office, picked up my shabby, beautiful suitcase, and I walked out of the penthouse. I didn't take the private elevator. I took the service elevator down to the ground floor. I walked right out the back entrance, into the cool night air, and I hailed a cab. The cab smelled like pine air freshener and old vinyl, a stark, welcome contrast to the sterile, scentless air of the penthouse. I gave the driver the address to Brenda's apartment, my voice shaking only a little. As the city lights blurred past the window, the full weight of what I had just done began to press down on me. My hands were trembling. I clenched them into fists, my short, practical nails digging into my palms. The pain was a grounding, real thing. I kept waiting for the crushing guilt, the paralyzing fear, the voice in my head that sounded like my mother telling me I'd made a terrible mistake. But it didn't come. Instead, there was a hollow, aching space where my marriage used to be, and filling it was a strange, buzzing energy. It was the energy of pure, unadulterated panic, but it was also the energy of being alive. My phone started buzzing in my purse. Liam. I didn't have to look. I imagined him in that silent, vast living room, staring at the papers on the floor, his disbelief curdling into rage. He wouldn't be calling to apologize. He'd be calling to control the narrative, to reel back in the one asset that had suddenly developed a mind of its own. Me. I silenced the phone and shoved it back into my bag. I looked at my reflection in the cab window, a pale, wide-eyed woman in a leather jacket that was a decade out of style, sitting next to a battered old suitcase. I looked like a runaway. I felt like one too. The cab pulled up in front of Brenda's brownstone, a building that was warm and slightly messy, with bikes chained to the railing and flower boxes overflowing with late-season blooms. It was a home, not a showpiece. I paid the driver and dragged my suitcase up the steps, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't even have to ring the bell. The door flew open, and Brenda stood there, dressed in yoga pants and an old college sweatshirt, her hair piled in a messy bun. She took one look at me, at the suitcase, at the jacket, at the wild look in my eyes, and her face shifted from surprise to grim understanding. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice soft. She didn't ask any questions. She just pulled me inside and into a tight, fierce hug, and that's when I broke. The dam of calm I had built finally shattered. Sobs racked my body, ugly and gasping. I cried for the man I'd lost years ago. I cried for the woman I'd buried. I cried out of terror for the vast, empty future that stretched out in front of me. Brenda just held me, letting me fall apart in her foyer. When the storm finally subsided into shaky hiccups, she guided me to her cozy, cluttered kitchen, sat me down at the wooden table, and pushed a giant mug of tea into my hands. "Okay," she said, sitting opposite me, her no-nonsense lawyer face on. "Start from the beginning." So I did. I told her about the suitcase, about the cold dismissal in his voice, the words, "sleep in the guest room." I told her about the folder, and the look on his face when he realized what it was. I told her about our negotiation, where he offered to buy my silence and my compliance with a generous allowance. I told her everything, my voice growing steadier with every word. When I finished, Brenda was silent for a moment, stirring her own tea. Then she looked at me, her eyes sharp. "Good," she said simply. "Good." I choked out. "It feels like my life is over." "No," she said, shaking her head. "The life you weren't living is over. The performance is over. Now the real work begins. And the first rule of a divorce from a man like Liam? You don't fight the war on his terms. He has more money, more resources, more power. He will try to drain you, financially and emotionally. He will try to make you look unstable, greedy, irrational. Our job is to not play that game. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. You said you don't want his money. Is that true? Really true? Because this isn't about punishment. This is about what you are legally and ethically entitled to. You built that life with him. You supported him through the startup years. Your contributions may not be on a balance sheet, but they have value. I thought about it. I thought about the years I spent working a boring admin job to pay our rent while he built his company. I thought about the countless networking events where I charmed investors' wives, the late nights I spent proofreading his business plans, the emotional support I provided that allowed him to focus entirely on his ambition. I had been an integral part of the machine that built Sterling Technologies, even if my name was nowhere on the patents. I don't want to be set for life like a pampered pet, I said slowly, the idea forming as I spoke. But you're right. I earned my share. I want enough to be secure. To start over. To not have to worry about a roof over my head while I figure out who I am without him. And then that's it. I want a clean break. Brenda nodded, a slow, approving smile spreading across her face. Okay. That I can work with. That's a strategy. We go in, we state our terms clearly and fairly, and we refuse to be drawn into a mudslinging contest. We present you as what you are, a rational woman who has made a rational decision to leave a marriage that is no longer viable. It sounded so clinical when she said it. But it was exactly what I needed. I needed the chaos of my emotions to be put into a structured, manageable plan. He's going to be furious, I whispered. Let him, Brenda said, her voice hard. His fury is not your problem anymore. It's his lawyer's problem. And from now on, you don't speak to him. You don't answer his texts or calls. Every communication goes through me. You are a black box, Evelyn. He gets nothing from you. The thought was both terrifying and liberating. To simply stop. To stop trying to explain myself, to stop trying to be understood, to stop managing his emotions. It was a luxury I hadn't allowed myself in years. I spent the night in Brenda's guest room, a real guest room, with a quilt handmade by her grandmother and a stack of well-loved books on the nightstand. It was the antithesis of the cold, impersonal room Liam had banished me to. I lay in the dark, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the city, and for the first time in a long, long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The future was a terrifying blank page, but it was mine, all mine. The first week was a strange, disorienting limbo. Brenda's apartment became my command center. My world, which had once been the sprawling, opulent spaces of the penthouse, shrank down to her cozy kitchen and the guest room. It was like being in a lifeboat after the ocean liner has sunk. Everything was smaller, more basic, but it was undeniably real. True to her word, Brenda became my shield. Liam's calls, which shifted from furious to pleading to coldly threatening, went unanswered. His emails, long and meticulously crafted messages that were part legal threat and part emotional manipulation, were forwarded directly to Brenda, who would read them aloud to me with theatrical disdain. He says you're causing him undue emotional distress and that your irrational behavior is impacting his ability to lead his company, she'd say, rolling her eyes as she scrolled through her tablet. Oh, and he's deeply concerned for your mental well-being. He suggests a private therapist he knows. How generous. I'd flinch every time. The old programming kicking in, the urge to soothe him, to fix it, to make the problem go away. But Brenda was a relentless coach. Don't you dare, she'd snap. This is all theater. He's building a case. He wants a reaction. Give him nothing. So I gave him nothing. Instead, I started building my own case, not for the lawyers, but for myself. Brenda had me start a journal. Not a feelings diary, she'd instructed. A facts diary. Write down the memories. The specific moments when you felt erased. The things you gave up. Don't editorialize. Just state what happened. It was the most painful homework of my life. Sitting at Brenda's kitchen table with a cheap spiral notebook, I began to excavate the ruins of my marriage. I wrote about the time I wanted to go back to school to get my master's in art history. Liam had laughed, not unkindly, and said, "Why would you do that? You don't need a job. If you're bored, redecorate the Hamptons house. And I, feeling foolish, had dropped it. I wrote about my friends, my real friends from before, the ones who weren't impressed by his money. One by one, they'd faded from my life. Liam always had a reason. She's so loud. He's a bit of a loser, isn't he? They just want access, Evie. I had let them go, too afraid of his disapproval. The most painful entry was about my mother. She'd passed away 2 years ago. In her final weeks, she'd been in a hospice facility. I had wanted to be with her every moment. But there was a massive merger happening at Liam's company. It's a critical time, he'd said, holding my shoulders. I need you by my side at these dinners. The investors expect to see a united front. We can fly out on the weekends. We'd flown out on 2 weekends. I was sitting at a black-tie gala, smiling at a man who owned a chain of supermarkets, while my mother took her last breath. The guilt of that had been a cold, hard stone in my gut ever since. Writing it down, seeing the words in my own handwriting, didn't absolve me, but it shifted the blame. I had been complicit, but he had built the prison. One afternoon, about 10 days after I'd left, Brenda came home from her office, her face a mixture of anger and grim satisfaction. She dropped her briefcase on the floor with a thud. "Okay," she said, pouring herself a glass of wine without even taking off her coat. "His lawyer, a very expensive shark named Arthur Finch, has made the first move." My heart jumped into my throat. And he's made an offer. A very, very generous one on the surface. She took a long sip. They're offering a one-time lump sum payment. $5 million. In exchange, you sign a comprehensive NDA, waive all future claims to his assets, and agree to a clause stating the marriage ended due to irreconcilable differences with no further elaboration. Ever. $5 million. It was an obscene amount of money. It was more than enough for that secure, worry-free life I'd told Brenda I wanted. It was a number designed to stun me into submission. "What's the catch?" I asked, my voice quiet. Brenda's smile was thin and sharp. "The catch is that it's a bribe. It's hush money. He's terrified of the story getting out." Billionaire CEO dumped by his wife over a suitcase isn't a great headline for the man who sells himself as the architect of the perfect, streamlined life. He wants to buy your silence and your dignity. He wants to pretend this never happened. I looked around Brenda's kitchen at the mismatched mugs and the fridge covered in her kids' drawings. I thought about my shabby suitcase sitting in the corner of the guest room. I thought about the journal, filled with my quiet, painful truths. $5 million to pretend I never existed. "No," I said. The word was clear and solid. Brenda raised an eyebrow. "No? Just like that? You don't want to think about it?" "I don't need to think about it," I said, and I realized it was true. If I take that money, I'm still letting him set the price for my life. I'm still letting him win. He gets to erase me with a check. I don't want his money if it comes with a gag order. Brenda's grim expression finally broke into a real wide smile. "Good. That's exactly what I told Finch we'd say." "You already said no?" "I know you, Evie. Or, I'm starting to remember the you that you used to be." She leaned forward. "So here's our counter. We ask for what you're entitled to under the law, a significant, but fair portion of the marital assets, accrued during the marriage. No NDA beyond the standard confidentiality of the settlement. The reason for the divorce is nobody's business but ours. We're not accepting a buyout. We are dissolving a partnership." It was a declaration of war. A quiet, legal war, but a war nonetheless. By refusing the easy money, I was forcing a process. I was forcing a conversation he desperately did not want to have. I was forcing him to sit across a table in some way and acknowledge that I existed, that I had value, and that I would not be erased. That night, I added another entry to my journal. Today, I was offered $5 million to disappear. I said no. It was the easiest decision I've made in years. For the first time, I felt like I was playing my own game, not just being a piece on his board. The fear was still there, a constant, low hum in the background. But it was being slowly, steadily, drowned out by something else. Something that felt a lot like respect. For myself. The silence from Liam's camp after we rejected his offer was louder than any phone call. It was a heavy, pressurized quiet that lasted for 2 weeks. Brenda said it was a classic tactic. They're trying to make you sweat. They think you'll get scared, get lonely, and come crawling back, willing to take their deal. But I wasn't crawling anywhere. A strange thing had started to happen in that silence. The world, which had felt so terrifyingly large and empty without the structure of my old life, began to slowly, tentatively open up. It started with Brenda's friends. She insisted I stop hiding in her apartment. "You need to remember how to talk to people who aren't me or a lawyer," she'd said, dragging me to a casual Friday night potluck. I was nervous. These were real people with real jobs and real problems. What would I even say? "Hi, I'm Evelyn. I recently left my billionaire husband and now I'm functionally homeless." But it wasn't like that. They were a teacher, a graphic designer, a nurse. They talked about their kids' soccer games, a frustrating project at work, a great new recipe they'd tried. Nobody cared about what fork I used. Nobody was impressed by the name Sterling. For the first time in a decade, I was just Evie. I found myself laughing, a real, unforced laugh that made my stomach hurt, at a story about a disastrous camping trip. I contributed to the conversation, talking about a documentary I'd seen on Brenda's couch. It was normal. It was breathtakingly mundane. And it was the most exciting night I'd had in years. The second thing that happened was I got a job. It was Brenda's idea, of course. "It's not about the money," she said. "It's about your sanity. It's about having a place to go and a reason to get dressed in the morning that has nothing to do with Liam." The thought was terrifying. I hadn't had a job since my admin days. My resume was a decade-long blank space, followed by the impossible-to-explain entry: personal assistant to the CEO of Sterling Technologies, which was just a fancy way of saying professional wife. But I scoured the listings anyway, my heart sinking. I was either overqualified or completely unqualified for everything. Then I saw it. A small, independent art gallery in a neighborhood I used to love, before it became too bohemian for Liam's taste, was looking for a gallery assistant. The duties included managing the front desk, handling social media, and helping with event setup. The pay was laughable, less than what Liam spent on dry cleaning in a month. But the listing ended with, "Must have a genuine passion for art and a willingness to learn." A genuine passion for art. It was the one part of me I had never fully managed to pack away. I'd secretly taken online art history courses. I'd read every book I could find. It was my dirty little secret, my hobby. I spent a whole day crafting a cover letter, pouring my heart out about my love for art, about how I believed it was essential to the human experience. I didn't mention Liam. I didn't mention the penthouse. I sent it off, convinced it would end up in a digital trash can. To my shock, I got an email back the next day from the owner, a woman named Anya, asking me to come in for an interview. The gallery was everything the penthouse wasn't. It was a warm, slightly chaotic space with exposed brick walls and scuffed wooden floors. The air smelled of coffee and turpentine. Anya was probably in her 60s, with wild gray hair, paint-stained fingers, and eyes that missed nothing. She didn't ask about the gap in my resume. She just talked about the artists she represented, her hands flying as she described their work. She showed me a series of haunting, beautiful landscapes. "This artist," she said, her voice dropping, "she paints about loss, about the spaces people leave behind." I looked at the paintings, at the empty chairs and the silent rooms, and I felt a lump form in my throat. I understood them. Deeply. "What do you see?" Anya asked, watching me closely. I took a breath. "I see the ghost of a presence. It's not about the person who's gone. It's about the shape they left in the air. The memory of warmth in a cold room." Anya was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. "The last girl just wanted to know if the frames were expensive." She looked me up and down, taking in my old jeans and leather jacket. "You're overqualified, you know. And I can't pay you much." "I don't care about the pay," I said, and it was the truth. I need to be here. In a place that feels real." She offered me the job on the spot. My first day was a whirlwind of learning a new cash register system, trying to remember artists' names, and figuring out how to make a decent pot of coffee. I made mistakes. I spilled coffee on a stack of flyers. I accidentally put the wrong price tag on a small sculpture, but nobody yelled at me. Anya just laughed and said, "Don't worry, darling. It's only art. It's meant to be lived with, not worshipped. That evening, as I was locking up the gallery, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. My blood ran cold. It had to be him. The message was simple. Evelyn, this has gone on long enough. We need to talk. In person. Liam. I stared at the words. The old fear, the old urge to comply, rose up like a tide. But then I looked back through the glass door of the gallery. I saw the paintings on the walls, the scuffed floor, the evidence of my first, messy, real day of work. I didn't feel like the woman who was supposed to sleep in the guest room anymore. I felt like the woman who had a key to an art gallery. I typed out a reply, my hands steady. All communication needs to go through my lawyer, Brenda. You have her number. I hit send, blocked the number, and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I walked down the street, towards the subway, surrounded by the noisy, messy, beautiful chaos of the city. I wasn't going back to Brenda's apartment feeling like a refugee. I was going home after a day's work. It was a small victory. Maybe the smallest. But as I stood on the crowded train, holding onto a pole, surrounded by tired people heading home, I felt a sense of belonging I had never felt in the back of Liam's chauffeured car. I had a place in the world. A small, simple, poorly paid place. But it was mine. I had built it myself. The summons arrived at Brenda's apartment a week later. A process server, a bored-looking young man in a cheap suit, handed me the thick envelope. My hands shook as I took it. It felt official. Final. This was no longer a behind-the-scenes legal skirmish. This was the war coming to my doorstep. Brenda, of course, was thrilled. Good, she said, snatching the envelope from me and slicing it open with a kitchen knife. He's forcing the process. He's impatient. Impatient people make mistakes. According to the documents, Liam was petitioning for the divorce on the grounds of irretrievable breakdown, which was a polite legal fiction. But buried in the legalese were his claims. He was lowballing the value of the marital estate, claiming that the massive growth of Sterling Technologies was due to his separate intellectual property developed before our marriage, a blatant lie, as I well knew. He was also requesting that I be denied spousal support, citing my voluntary unemployment and lack of contribution to the marital partnership. Lack of contribution. The words burned on the page. I thought of the years of emotional labor, the social engineering, the sheer effort of being the acceptable wife of a man climbing that high. It had been a full-time job, just one that didn't come with a paycheck or a title. He's trying to rewrite history, I whispered, the paper crinkling in my clenched fist. Of course he is, Brenda said, her eyes scanning the documents. That's what powerful people do. They don't just want to win. They want to erase any evidence that a battle was even fought. But he messed up. She tapped a paragraph. He's triggered discovery. Now we get to dig. And we have the receipts, CV. Not the financial ones, but the human ones. The next phase was a deep, grueling dive into the past I had just begun to escape. Brenda and I spent evenings surrounded by boxes. We weren't looking for bank statements. We were building a timeline of a life. I dug out old photo albums from a storage unit, pictures of us in that first apartment, of me at his first rickety trade show booth, beaming with pride. I found birthday cards he'd written me in the early days, filled with promises and gratitude. I couldn't have done this without you, one of them said. Brenda scanned them all. More importantly, I made a list. A list of every person I could remember from the early days. The first employees, the early investors, the friends who had been pushed aside. Brenda's investigators started tracking them down. Meanwhile, my new life at the gallery continued. It was my sanctuary. Anya never asked about the legal papers I sometimes brought with me, or the days I came in with red-rimmed eyes after a difficult session with Brenda. She just put me to work, teaching me how to stretch a canvas, how to properly light a sculpture, how to talk to potential buyers not about investment, but about feeling. One afternoon, I was in the back room, carefully cataloging new pieces, when my phone buzzed. It was Brenda. "You are not going to believe this," she said, her voice crackling with excitement. "We found gold. Remember Mark? The scruffy programmer who was Liam's first hire." A memory surfaced. Mark. Brilliant, awkward, with a nervous laugh. He'd been pushed out after the first round of venture capital, deemed not a cultural fit for the sleek new company Liam was building. "I remember," I said. "He's a professor now." And he was more than happy to talk. "He remembers you, Evie. He remembers you bringing dinner to the office for 3 months straight when they were coding day and night. He remembers you calming down a furious early investor when the first product demo crashed." He said, and I quote, "Liam was the vision, but Evie was the glue. That company would have shattered into 1,000,000 pieces without her in those first 2 years." He's willing to give a deposition. I sank onto a stool, my legs suddenly weak. Glue. It wasn't a glamorous title, but it was the truth. It was a contribution. Someone had seen it. A few days later, another call. It was Sarah, the wife of one of the early investors. She and I had been close once, before our husbands had a falling out. "Evelyn," she'd said on the phone, her voice warm. "I heard. I'm not surprised. That man always did treat you like a trophy. I remember at the product launch party, you were the one who smoothed everything over. Liam was too busy preening for the press. You are worth 10 of him." Piece by piece, a counter-narrative was being built. It wasn't about greed. It was about acknowledgement. We were assembling an army of ghosts from our past, all of them ready to testify to the woman I had been, the partner I had been, before I was slowly polished into an ornament. Brenda compiled all of it, the photos, the cards, the witness statements, into a formal response to Liam's petition. It was a volley back across the bow. It said, "You can try to erase me, but I have witnesses. I have evidence. I existed." We didn't hear anything for a while after that. Then, an email from Arthur Finch arrived in Brenda's inbox. The tone had changed. It was less arrogant, more weary. He was requesting a mediation session. A private, off-the-record meeting to see if we could reach a settlement without the expense and publicity of a trial. Brenda read me the email, a triumphant glint in her eye. "He's blinking," she said. "He saw our evidence. He knows we're not just going to roll over. He knows that if this goes to court, we can paint a very public, very ugly picture of who Liam Sterling really is behind closed doors." Mediation. It meant I would have to see him. Sit in a room with him. The thought made my skin crawl. "I don't know if I can do that," I admitted, my voice small. "You can," Brenda said, her voice firm. "Because you're not going in as the woman he banished to the guest room. You're going in as the glue. And glue is a lot harder to break than glass." I looked down at my hands. They were no longer perfectly manicured. There was a smudge of blue paint under one nail from helping Anya mix pigments. They looked like they belonged to someone who did things. Someone who built things. Maybe Brenda was right. Maybe I was stronger than I looked. The mediation was held in a conference room on the top floor of a sleek, anonymous downtown building. It was a room designed to intimidate, all dark wood, cold glass, and a view that seemed to own the entire city. Brenda and I arrived first. I'd worn a simple, well-tailored black dress that was neither expensive nor cheap. It was just mine. I refused to dress for his world anymore. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I clutched Brenda's arm as we walked in. "Breathe," she murmured. "You hold the power here. He's the one who's scared." The door opened, and Liam walked in with Arthur Finch. My breath hitched. He looked older. The perfectly curated image was still there, the custom suit, the confident posture, but there were new lines of tension around his mouth, a tightness in his shoulders I hadn't seen before. He looked at me, and for a single, unguarded moment, I saw not anger, but sheer unadulterated shock. He was looking at me. Not the polished version of me he'd created, but the real one. The one in the simple dress, with determined eyes and no wedding ring on my finger. I saw him process it, and I saw the understanding dawn in his eyes. The woman he thought he could control was gone. We sat across the long, polished table from each other. The mediator, a calm, older woman named Patricia, began explaining the process. I barely heard her. My entire being was focused on holding my ground, on not looking away. Arthur Finch spoke first, his voice a smooth, oily instrument. He reiterated their position, using softer language but still pushing the narrative of my minimal contribution. He talked about post-marital lifestyle adjustments and reasonable support. Then it was Brenda's turn. She didn't raise her voice. She placed a single, slim folder on the table. "We're not here to talk about reasonable support," she said, her tone conversational. "We're here to dissolve a business partnership. A partnership in which my client, Evelyn, was a founding partner in all but name." She opened the folder. She didn't pull out financial charts. She slid a photograph across the table. It was a picture of Liam and me, maybe 10 years ago, sitting on the floor of our old apartment, surrounded by pizza boxes and lines of code printed on paper. We were both laughing. My head was on his shoulder. We looked exhausted and happy. Liam's face went pale. He stared at the photo as if it were a ghost. "That was taken the night you secured your first seed funding, Liam," Brenda said softly. "Evelyn spent that entire week helping you rehearse your pitch, calming your nerves, and as Mark Thompson recalls in his signed affidavit, she was the one who personally called every single one of your beta testers when the server crashed, keeping them from abandoning the product." She slid another paper forward. Excerpt from Mark's deposition. Finch started to object. "Your Honor, this is sentimental. This is evidence of contribution." Brenda cut him off, her voice sharpening. "This is evidence of the glue that held Sterling Technologies together during its most fragile period. We have statements from Sarah Jenkins, from David Chan, from half a dozen others who were there. They all say the same thing. Evelyn was integral. To dismiss her contribution now is not just legally dubious, it's a profound act of bad faith." She let the words hang in the air. Liam was still staring at the photo. He hadn't looked away. "This isn't about a suitcase, Liam," I said, my voice quiet but clear. It was the first time I'd spoken directly to him. His eyes snapped up to meet mine. "This is about you treating me like one. Something to be used, then discarded when it no longer fit your aesthetic. Something to be stored away in the guest room when it became inconvenient." He flinched. Actually flinched. I saw a muscle in his jaw twitch. "You wanted a perfect life," I continued, the words flowing now, fueled by a lifetime of silence. "But you confused perfect with polished. You confused love with control. I wasn't your partner. I was your prop. And I won't be paid off to pretend otherwise." The room was utterly silent. Arthur Finch looked uncomfortable, shuffling his papers. The mediator watched us with keen interest. Liam finally spoke, his voice rough, stripped of its usual cool authority. I never saw it that way." "I know you didn't," I said, and I felt a pang of genuine pity for him. "That's the tragedy. You were so busy building your empire, you didn't notice you were tearing down our home." He looked down at his hands, clenched on the table. The silence stretched. I could see him wrestling with it, with the version of history Brenda and I had just presented. The true version. Arthur Finch leaned over and whispered something urgently in his ear. Liam shook his head, a sharp, frustrated gesture. He was losing, and he knew it. The legal battle would be long, expensive, and publicly damaging. We had the evidence to drag his name through the mud he was so terrified of. He looked at me again, and this time his gaze was different. It wasn't cold or angry or dismissive. It was tired, and for the first time it was honest. "What do you want, Evelyn?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me what you really want." I took a deep breath. This was it. The moment of truth. "I want a fair share of the assets we built together. Not a payoff. A share. I want to be able to start my life over without looking over my shoulder. And most of all," I said, holding his gaze, "I want you to acknowledge in this room right now that I was your partner. That what I did mattered. That I mattered. It wasn't about the money. Not really. It was about the story. I needed him to rewrite the ending, to put me back into the narrative he had tried so hard to erase." He was silent for a long time, staring at the photograph of us on the floor, young and in love and building a future together. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, he looked defeated, but also strangely relieved. He nodded slowly, then turned to his lawyer. "Arthur, draw up the papers. Give her what she's asking for." Finch sputtered. "Liam, I must advise." "I don't care," Liam said, his voice flat. "Just do it." He stood up, not looking at any of us, and walked out of the room. I sat there trembling. Brenda put a steadying hand on my shoulder, a huge grin on her face. We had won. But as the shock faded, I realized it wasn't the victory I had imagined. There was no glory in it. Just a profound, echoing sadness for the two kids in that photograph, and the long, winding road that had led us here, to this cold room and this expensive silence. He had finally heard me. But it was too late. The only thing left to do was divide what remained and walk away. The weeks after the mediation were a strange, anticlimactic blur. The legal machinery, now that Liam had capitulated, whirred into efficient motion. Brenda handled the flood of paperwork, the asset valuations, the transfer of funds. My fair share turned out to be a number so large it felt abstract, a string of digits in a new bank account that had no connection to the reality of my life. It was security. It was freedom. But it wasn't happiness. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt hollowed out, like a tree that had been struck by lightning, still standing, but scorched and empty inside. The fight was over, and the silence that followed was deafening. I'd spent months defining myself in opposition to Liam, as the woman fighting back. Now who was I? I threw myself into my work at the gallery. Anya, with her preternatural wisdom, seemed to understand. She gave me more responsibility, trusting me to curate a small corner of the space for emerging local artists. I called it the Annex. It was my project, my little kingdom of scuffed floors and raw talent. I found I had a knack for it, for seeing the potential in a rough, emotional piece, for talking to the artists, who were often as nervous and uncertain as I was. One afternoon, I was hanging a series of stark, black-and-white photographs, a study on abandoned places, when a familiar voice behind me made me jump. Evelyn. I turned, a handful of picture-hanging hooks clutched in my fist. It was Ben. Ben from the potluck. Brenda's friend, the graphic designer. He was holding a takeout coffee cup and looking around the gallery with genuine interest. Ben. Hi, I said, suddenly self-conscious. I was wearing old jeans covered in a dust, and my hair was tied up in a messy knot. I was in the neighborhood, grabbing a coffee, and I remembered Brenda saying you worked here, he said, smiling. It was a warm, easy smile. This place is great. These photos are incredible. So, lonely but in a beautiful way. We talked about the artist, about the use of light and shadow. It was an easy, flowing conversation. He didn't treat me like a fragile divorcee or a suddenly wealthy heiress. He talked to me like I was just a person who knew about art. It was the most normal and the most extraordinary thing that had happened to me in months. He asked if I wanted to grab a coffee with him sometime, and before my brain could conjure up a dozen reasons to say no, I'm not ready, it's too soon, what would people think, I heard myself say, yes, I'd like that. Our first coffee was awkward for about 5 minutes. Then we started talking about our favorite terrible movies, and the awkwardness vanished. He was funny and self-deprecating. He talked about his failed attempt to build a treehouse for his niece, and how it ended up looking like a wooden seizure. I laughed until I cried. He asked me questions about myself and actually listened to the answers. He didn't flinch when I briefly mentioned my divorce. He just nodded and said, "Rough stuff. I'm glad you're on the other side of it." It was so simple. So undramatic. There were no power plays, no hidden agendas. He was just a good guy. I started seeing him regularly. Coffee turned into walks in the park, which turned into dinners at noisy, casual restaurants that didn't have a single Michelin star. It was all so light. With Liam, every interaction had weight, a subtext, a purpose. With Ben, it was just about enjoying each other's company. One evening, about a month after we'd started seeing each other, we were at his apartment, a comfortably cluttered space filled with books, records, and his own graphic art on the walls. We were cooking pasta together, and I was telling him a story about a particularly difficult artist I was dealing with at the gallery. I was waving a wooden spoon around for emphasis, and he was laughing, his eyes crinkling at the corners. And in that moment, standing in a warm, messy kitchen, with the smell of garlic and basil filling the air, and a kind man laughing at my story had happened, I felt a flicker of joy. It wasn't the explosive, dramatic happiness of victory. It was a small, quiet, steady flame, like a pilot light I thought had gone out forever. It was the joy of being seen, of being liked, for exactly who I was in that moment, a woman covered in a little flower, telling a silly story, in a kitchen that wasn't hers. It was the joy of a life being built, not bought. Later that night, back at Brenda's, I lay in bed and thought about it. I wasn't in love with Ben. Not yet. And that was okay. What he had given me was something far more important. He had handed me a mirror and shown me a reflection of a woman who could be happy again. A woman who could laugh easily, who could be interesting without a famous last name, who could have a future that wasn't defined by her past. The hollow feeling was still there, but it wasn't as vast. I was starting to fill it, with the satisfaction of a well-hung show at the gallery, with the warmth of Brenda's friendship, with the simple, uncomplicated pleasure of a good meal with a good person. The divorce had been about dismantling a life. Now, piece by piece, I was assembling a new one. And for the first time, I was genuinely excited to see what it would look like. The final divorce decree arrived on a Tuesday. It came in a thick, cream-colored envelope, delivered by a different, equally bored-looking process server. Brenda handed it to me over our morning coffee. "It's official," she said, her voice soft. "You're free." I took the envelope. It felt heavy, but not with the weight of sadness or regret. It felt like the weight of a door closing, firmly and finally. I didn't open it right away. I just set it on the kitchen table and finished my toast. The world didn't end. The sun kept shining. It was just a Tuesday. A few hours later, I found myself standing outside a small modern apartment building, keys in my hand. It was the first place I looked at on my own. It wasn't a penthouse. It was on the 3rd floor, with 2 bedrooms and a view of a small communal garden. The floors were hardwood, slightly uneven in places. The kitchen was small, but it had a window that let in the afternoon sun. It was perfect. I used my money. Not Liam's money. My money. The share of the life we'd built. I'd bought it outright. It was the first major purchase I had ever made completely on my own for myself. It wasn't an investment. It was a home. The movers had come the day before. My possessions were a strange, hybrid collection. There were a few pieces of tasteful, neutral furniture I'd taken from the penthouse, things I'd actually liked. And then there were the new things. A bright, impossibly soft yellow armchair I'd fallen in love with at a flea market. A rustic wooden dining table I'd found at a thrift store and refinished myself, with Anya cheering me on. And my suitcase, of course, sitting proudly in the walk-in closet, its duct tape and crooked will a badge of honor. I spent the day unpacking, the sounds of the city, a siren in the distance, kids playing in the garden below, a comforting soundtrack. I hung my few pieces of art, not the cold, expensive abstracts from the penthouse, but a vibrant, slightly chaotic painting by one of the artists from the annex, and a few of those black and white photographs of abandoned places Ben had helped me choose. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I stood in the middle of my new living room. The boxes were broken down. The books were on the shelves. The yellow armchair was positioned perfectly to catch the evening light. It was done. A profound silence settled over the space. But this silence was different from the heavy, oppressive quiet of the penthouse. This silence was peaceful. It was mine to fill with whatever I wanted. With music, with laughter, with the quiet turning of a page. I thought about Liam. I wondered what he was doing. Probably in some boardroom, or at a charity gala, building his empire higher. I felt no anger. Just a distant, quiet pity. He was still in his gilded cage, and he probably didn't even know the door was unlocked. He was the one who was truly trapped, a prisoner of his own image. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Ben. "How's the first night in the new place? Want company? I can bring pizza and a terrible movie." I smiled. A real, easy smile. I looked around my apartment at the evidence of my own life, built with my own hands and my own choices. Yes, I typed back. That sounds perfect. I wasn't just free from something anymore. I was free to something. Free to choose a yellow armchair. Free to date a kind graphic designer. Free to come home to a space that smelled like me and no one else. The journey hadn't been about getting a divorce. It had been about getting a life. And as I heard Ben's knock on my door, the smell of pizza wafting into the hallway, I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that my life was only just beginning. It's been a year now. A whole year since I handed Liam those papers. Sometimes, it feels like a lifetime ago. Other times, a specific memory will surface. The cold feel of the marble foyer under my bare feet, the exact shade of gray in his eyes when he dismissed me, and it's like it happened yesterday. But the sting is gone. Now, those memories are just data. Points on a map that show me how far I've come. My life looks nothing like I thought it would. And everything like it was always supposed to. The gallery is thriving. Anya made me a full partner 6 months ago. The annex isn't just a corner anymore. It's become our signature, the thing we're known for, spotting raw emotional talent. I have a purpose now that isn't tied to anyone else's success. It's mine. I still get nervous before a new show opens, but it's a good nervous. The kind that comes from caring deeply about something you've built. Ben and I are still together. It's not some dramatic, all-consuming romance. It's steady. It's kind. We spend weekends hiking or exploring weird little towns, and he still makes me laugh harder than anyone. He's teaching me how to be in a relationship where I'm an equal, where my voice matters just as much as his. It's a skill I'm still learning, but he's a patient teacher. I saw Liam once about 3 months ago. It was a complete accident. I was leaving a coffee shop, and he was walking in. We almost collided in the doorway. For a second, we just stared at each other. He looked the same, maybe a little more tired. "Evelyn," he said, and his voice was neutral. "Careful." "Liam," I replied. My heart wasn't pounding. My hands weren't shaking. There was an awkward pause. The kind you have with someone you went to high school with a lifetime ago. "I heard about the gallery," he finally said. "Congratulations." It wasn't a dig. It sounded genuine. It was the first time he'd ever acknowledged a success of mine that had nothing to do with him. "Thank you," I said. And I meant it. He nodded, looked like he wanted to say something else, then seemed to think better of it. He just gave another curt nod and walked into the shop. And that was it. No earth-shattering revelation. No last-minute plea. Just two people who used to share a life, passing like ships in the afternoon. There was no anger left in me for him. Just a quiet hope that he finds his own version of peace, whatever that looks like. I walked away from that encounter feeling light. The final thread had been severed, not with a snap, but with a quiet sigh. So, if you're watching this, maybe you're in a place I was in a year ago. Maybe you're feeling small or unheard, or like you're living a life that belongs to someone else. Maybe you're sleeping in the proverbial guest room of your own existence. I'm here to tell you that you have a choice. It won't be easy. God, it will be the hardest thing you'll ever do. You'll cry until you're empty. You'll be so terrified you'll feel sick. You'll have to face parts of yourself you've been hiding away for years. But on the other side of that fear is you. The real you. The one you packed away in a box, thinking they weren't good enough, or strong enough, or shiny enough. My story wasn't about getting revenge on a billionaire. It was about a woman reclaiming her own name. My name is Evelyn. Not Mrs. Sterling. Evelyn. I learned that your value isn't determined by the price tag on your luggage, or the square footage of your home, or the man whose name you take. It's in the scars and the stories, and the crooked wheels that prove you've traveled a long, hard road. My life now isn't perfect. It's messy. There are bills to pay, and disagreements with Ben, and stressful days at the gallery. But it's real. It's all real. And it's all mine. So take that first step, however small. Pack your own suitcase, no matter how shabby it seems, and walk out that door. The world on the other side is waiting for you. And I promise you, it's so much brighter than the light in any gilded cage.